Have you ever tasted the feeling of freedom? A pure, unfiltered freedom that fills your lungs as you breathe it in, that seeps into every cell of your body, only to face, in the very next moment, the terrifying possibility of losing it forever? That's not a rhetorical question. That is the emotion, the breath, the heartbeat of an entire nation in the historic autumn of 1945. Let's turn back the wheel of time, not to the battles of fire and smoke, but to the most radiant dawn of all. Hanoi, September 2nd, 1945. Botting Square was no longer just a physical space. It had transformed into a sea of people, an ocean of humanity like never before. From every direction they came, from poor rural villages outside the city, from cramped attics in the 36 ancient streets, all flowing toward one center. They didn't just walk, they drifted like waves of hope surging toward the same dream. In their hands were red flags with golden stars, lovingly hand-sewn, their fabric still fresh and fragrant, waving freely for the very first time under their own sky. The air was thick with emotion, indescribable yet undeniable. It was the explosion of joy after nearly a century of oppression, the innocent curiosity of children witnessing something grand for the first time, and the tears running down the wrinkled cheeks of an old father who had lived almost his whole life as a second-class citizen in his own homeland. In that sea of people, perhaps there stood a farmer, his feet still muddy, looking up at the podium in awe, trying to grasp what the word independence truly meant. Perhaps there was a young student in her white ao dai, clutching her book to her chest, her heart pounding with dreams of a future she could finally shape herself. And then, from the platform, a voice rose, warm, clear, and powerful. Open quote. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Close quote. Each sentence, each word of the Declaration of Independence resounded, not as a dry political statement, but as a sacred oath, a solemn affirmation of what millions of hearts longed for. It declared that from that very moment, we were no longer subjects. We were a nation with a name, an identity, and a dignity. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was born. The dawn of independence had broken, brilliant, radiant, and full of promise. But as you know, the most beautiful dawn often comes when darkness still lurks just beyond the horizon. Joy was fleeting. Even before the cheers had faded, before the tears of happiness had dried, the shadows of the past began to return, bringing with them a storm even more brutal than before. In the aftermath of World War II, the great powers of the world rearranged their chessboard, leaving no place for a young Vietnam to decide its own fate. Under the Potsdam Agreement, Chinese nationalist forces were to enter the north to disarm the Japanese, while in the south, the task fell to the British. But that was only a pretext. Behind the British troops came the French warships, massive and imposing, sailing into Saigon under the tricolor flag, carrying with them an unmistakable ambition to restore colonial rule. They could not accept losing the jewel of their empire. To them, our independence was merely a historical accident that needed to be erased. And so, the inevitable happened. Just 21 days after Independence Day, in the night of September 22nd to 23rd, 1945, Saigon, the pearl of the Far East, did not sleep. Gunfire tore through the night. French forces, aided by the British, launched a surprise attack on the Southern Administrative Committee headquarters. The song of peace was silenced, replaced by screams, destruction, and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The war had begun, not with a formal declaration, but with a blatant act of betrayal. The dream of freedom had barely begun and was already stained with blood. The people of Saigon Cholon, those who had just marched to celebrate independence, now turned their tables, chairs, and doors into makeshift barricades. Civilian militias armed only with sticks and sharpened bamboo spears rose up bravely. They did not fight to conquer. They fought to protect what they had just found. The South resists. The cry echoed from Saigon across the Mekong Delta, over the plains and forests, a blazing signal of defiance in a war that was unequal but unavoidable. While the South burned, the young government in Hanoi faced an impossible situation. In the north, 200,000 Chinese troops poured in like a flood, bringing along political factions intent on overthrowing the revolution. In the south, French forces pressed harder every day. The nation was caught in a deadly vise, its fragile independence flickering like a candle in the wind. President Ho Chi Minh and his comrades played a masterful diplomatic game, alternating between firmness and concession, seeking temporary peace with the Chinese so they could focus on the greater threat, the French. Painful compromises were made, concessions that history still looks back on with sorrow, all to buy time, even a single day, for the people to rebuild in peace. But the greed of colonialism knew no bounds. Every attempt at peace was met with escalating aggression. They attacked Haiphong, turning the beautiful port city into an inferno, killing thousands of civilians. They provoked in Lang Son, in Da Nang, and then marched into Hanoi. The capital, once filled with joy, now grew tense and suffocating. The sound of French legionnaire boots striking the pavement echoed ominously. Hostility glimmered in every glance, and rifle barrels pointed at civilians. Then came the ultimatum, delivered on December 18th and 19th, 1946. Its contents were nothing short of a demand for surrender. The Vietnamese government must dissolve its self-defense forces and hand over control of Hanoi to the French. The nation faced a choice, brutal and inescapable, to bow down and abandon the hard-won independence, returning to slavery, so that our children would live again in darkness, or to rise up and fight, with whatever we had, even if only bamboo spears, even if only with our will and our rage, against one of the strongest armies in the world. It was a choice between living in humiliation or dying with honor. A choice no one wanted, but history demanded we make. In a small house in Van Phuc, Ha Dong, on the night of December 19th, the light still burned. A historic decision was made. The call for national resistance echoed like a thunderclap across the silent winter night, marking the beginning of a tragic yet glorious chapter in our nation's story. 9 years. 9 years of blood and flowers, of tears and songs of heroism. 9 years that began that very night, born from one sacred choice, freedom or slavery. And how did that 3,000-day journey unfold? How did a nation, newly freed from chains, armed with nothing but bare hands and unbreakable will, stand against and overcome the impossible? That is the story we shall uncover in the next chapter. 2003, December 19th, 1946. The city of Hanoi, the heart of the nation, suddenly plunged into darkness. All the lights went out. That moment of transition between light and dark was not merely a technical action. It was a signal, a vow, a silent order that the era of peace, however fragile, had ended. That darkness did not bring fear. It brought readiness. Immediately afterward, from Lang Fortress, the first roars of artillery tore the thick night apart. The shells carried fire, hatred, and the sworn pledge of independence, fired straight at French positions. The command for national resistance had come into effect. The great patriotic war of the nation had officially begun, not at negotiation tables, but on every street corner, every rooftop of the beloved capital. Imagine it. Hanoi's 36 streets, which just hours before were streets of silks, of street vendors' calls, of melodies at night, of smiles and rendezvous, suddenly turned into a battlefield. There were no clear front lines. Enemy and friend were side by side. In the luxury hotels, French soldiers rushed out, rifles ready, stunned by a resistance they could not believe. And from every nook and cranny, from the moss-covered old houses, the sons and daughters of Hanoi rose up. They were not professionally trained soldiers. They were workers just leaving the workshops, hands still smelling of oil. They were pupils whose ink had not yet dried on the page. They were artisans, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. What were their weapons? Old rifles, grenades, three-pronged bombs, suicidal weapons whose very name conveyed the resolve to die so the fatherland may live. But their most potent weapon was this city itself. Every house became a fortress. Every street became a trap. The scorched earth plan was executed thoroughly and painfully. Think about this. It was not about burning down the enemy's house. It was about tearing down the house you loved with your own hands. The antique lacquer bed left by grandparents, the sturdy ironwood door, the handcart that was the family fortune, all were brought into the streets. The people of Hanoi turned their dearest possessions into gigantic obstacles to block the advance of enemy tanks. Romantic streets were now cluttered with tables, chairs, cabinets, lampposts, even overturned tramcars. Hanoi turned itself into a magic square, a labyrinth ready to swallow anyone daring to invade. And within that maze, the martyrs' squads wrote their legend. They were the soul of the 60-day and night struggle. They embraced three-pronged bombs and charged at enemy tanks, turning themselves into living torches to light the path for their comrades. Some recounted that those young men calmly sang to each other before going to battle. They sang about Hanoi, about autumn, about the girls they loved. The elegance of Trang An did not vanish. It was tempered by steel and fire, becoming an ultimate tragic romance. They fought not only with hatred, but with love. Love for this land, for every brick and every tree. That was why they could fight with such extraordinary strength. The fighting raged in every house, every street corner. Bac Bo Phu, the post office by the lake, Hang Kos Station, Long Bien Bridge, all became hotspots. The French, with absolute superiority in firepower, tanks, and aircraft, thought they could crush this resistance within 24 hours. But they were wrong. 24 hours passed, then a week, then a month. Hanoi still stood. Our guns still fired. The red flag with the golden star still proudly flew over a corner of the burning Dongzuan market. Every meter the French advanced cost them blood. They captured one house, only to find the next house a new stronghold. They could not understand how a ragtag force with crude weapons could fight so stubbornly. They did not realize they were not only fighting the capital's defense force, the city self-defense, but an entire people. They were confronting the will of the people, the most impregnable fortress no weapon could pierce. However, the battle in Hanoi, brave as it was never intended from the start to win the final victory there. It was a noble act, an epic to achieve a greater strategic objective. While all of Hanoi was straining itself, turning into a living shield, behind the scenes a grand evacuation, a long march of the entire nation, was quietly underway. This was not a retreat. It was a sacred withdrawal. President Ho Chi Minh, the party central committee, the government, and the command organs calmly left the capital, moving up the Red River and the Low River toward the Viet Bac base. It was a decision brilliantly wise. Losing Hanoi did not mean losing the country. Losing the resistance leadership would have been true defeat. And to protect that withdrawal, every soldier and every citizen of Hanoi volunteered to stay, to be the obstacle that held the enemy back. Not only people were evacuated, an entire nascent industry was also moved. Tens of factories and enterprises were dismantled. Every bolt, every gear, every multi-ton machine was carefully removed by workers, wrapped, then hoisted onto buffalo carts and bamboo boats, crossing under enemy fire deep into the base areas. Picture that. Amid the sound of gunfire, the caravans quietly carried not only iron and steel, but the economic potential, the material foundation for a protracted resistance. They carried printing presses, newspaper presses, manuscripts, scientific works. They carried the nation's future on their frail shoulders. After nearly 60 days and nights of valiant struggle, the mission to hold the enemy in Hanoi was successfully completed. On the night of February 17, 1947, the Capital Regiment, the last soldiers, received the order to withdraw. They had fought to the last bullet, to the last drop of blood, fulfilling their vow. Their retreat was also a miracle, a masterstroke, as they secretly slipped through the dense encirclement of the French under Long Bien Bridge, crossed the icy Red River, and safely returned to the base. Before leaving, they left words on Hanoi's scorched walls. See you again. That was not an empty promise. It was a prophecy. The French advanced into a ravaged Hanoi. They had won a battle, but lost the whole strategy. They occupied an empty shell. Because the soul of the resistance, the leadership mind, the main force army, and the will of the Vietnamese people had been preserved and successfully moved to Viet Bac. The urban war had ended to open a new phase, the war of the people, guerrilla warfare over a much larger terrain, the mountains and forests. The enemy had fallen into a trap they did not see. They thought planting their flag on the presidential palace roof meant the end of the war. But no, that was actually when the war began. A war in which the advantages of tanks and artillery would matter less. A war in which the hearts of the people, the terrain, and time would be our greatest allies. The 3,000-day journey had only passed its first 60 days soaked with blood, but full of pride. Now, in the Viet Bac mountains and forests, a government without a capital, an army without a regular barracks, a people facing countless hardships, what would they do next? how to rebuild from scratch, to fight and to defeat a mighty empire. That will be the fiercest challenge, the most epic chapter we will turn together in the next part. If the 60 days and nights of Hanoi were an epic of fire and steel, of urban courage, then the early days in Viet Bắc were a silent symphony of endurance and rebirth. The Great Long March had brought the heart of the resistance into the mountains and forests. But this was not a safe return. It was the beginning of an even more formidable trial. The enemy was no longer directly in sight, within gun range. The enemy was now everywhere. It was the gnawing hunger after days of exhausting movement. It was the deadly jungle malaria that could fell a strong man overnight. It was deprivation to the extreme. No medicine, no cloth, not even salt. Viet Bắc, the capital of the winds, welcomed the children of the resistance with its pristine, majestic, but incredibly harsh nature. Imagine a government without a single official building. The workplaces of President Ho Chi Minh and the Party Central Committee were simple bamboo huts hidden under ancient trees. A flat rock by the stream might serve as a desk. National documents were stored in bamboo tubes. Meetings deciding the fate of the nation were held beside flickering campfires, under the starlit sky. In this unimaginable scarcity, the brain of the resistance still worked with astonishing vigor. A country was being run from the depths of the jungle. Amidst the calls of gibbons and birds, one could still hear the clicking of typewriters and the rustle of papers shaping national policy. Even in his famous poem Can Quia, Night Scene, President Ho wrote, "The stream's murmur sounds like distant singing. The moonlight through the trees mingles with flowers' shadows." Amid endless worries about war and governance, his soul still harmonized with nature, turning hardship into a revolutionary beauty. That was not merely poetry. It was the spirit, the essence of the entire resistance, turning the impossible into possible, finding strength within adversity. And it wasn't just the leadership. A miniature society was being built amid the green forest. The heavy industrial machines, carried piece by piece from the lowlands, were now reassembled in caves and secluded valleys. The Trun Hung Dao armament factory, the heart of the young defense industry, began producing rifles and grenades made in Viet Bắc. The sounds of hammer and anvil echoed through the mountains, blending with the voices of literacy classes under the trees. The fight against hunger and illiteracy was as important as the military front. Newspapers like Ku Quoc, Save the Nation, and the Tai Ching Ku Ho currency were printed in makeshift presses and carried by couriers across the country, linking the base area with the lowlands, connecting the party's will with the people's hearts. It was a miracle of vitality. In the harshest conditions, our nation not only survived, it built, created, and prepared for a long confrontation. But the enemy did not give us time. After capturing Hanoi and major cities, the French quickly realized their fatal mistake. They had taken the body, but not the soul. The heart and mind of the resistance still beat strongly in Viet Bắc. They decided to crush that heart with a thunderous blow. In October 1947, General Salon, one of France's most cunning strategists, devised an audacious and dangerous plan codenamed Operation Léa. Its goal was clear: catch them all in one sweep. The French aimed to use a massive steel pincer, a combination of naval, land, and air forces, to surround and annihilate our resistance headquarters and main army in Viet Bắc. They believed that capturing President Ho Chi Minh or wiping out the command would cause the resistance to collapse like a headless snake. Imagine the scale of this assault. Over 12,000 elite troops equipped with modern weapons, divided into 3 powerful wings. The first, elite paratroopers, would suddenly drop right into the heart of Viet Bắc. Bắc Can, Chợ Mới, Chợ Don, like a dagger striking the heart. The second, a strong mechanized force, would move from Lang Son along Route 4 to Cao Bang, then descend toward Bắc Can, forming the eastern pincer. The third, consisting of warships and infantry, would sail up the Red and Low rivers toward Tuyen Quang and Chiem Hoa, forming the western pincer. The 3 prongs would close in perfectly, turning the entire ATK, safety zone, into a death trap. On paper, the plan was flawless, combining surprise, speed, and overwhelming power. The French were confident, believing the war would end in a few weeks. Then, on the morning of October 7, 1947, the tranquil sky of Viet Bắc was torn apart by the roar of hundreds of aircraft. From above, French paratroopers descended like hawks hunting prey. They landed dangerously close to where President Ho and the party leadership were working. The situation hung by a thread, life and death, victory or defeat of the entire resistance measured in minutes and meters. At times, French troops were only a few hundred meters away from where Ho Chi Minh had been. They searched frantically, but found only a half-eaten meal and a still warm fire. Under the protection of his guards, the president and leaders calmly relocated to safety, melting into the vast forest and among the people. The largest French manhunt began in failure. They had arrived at the right place, but found nothing. Like hunters storming into a jungle unaware that their prey was not a timid deer, but a wise tiger that knew every trail. Our command, led by General Vong Nguyen Giap, had already grasped the enemy's plan. Instead of panicking or confronting the superior forces head-on, we adopted a brilliant strategy. Avoid the strong, strike the weak. We did not foolishly fight the mechanized divisions on open roads, nor stubbornly defend every inch of land. The order was given: destroy the French winter offensive. All of Viet Buc instantly became a battlefield without front lines. Every mountain, stream, and village turned into a fortress. Our main forces dispersed to avoid the enemy's heavy blows, while guerrilla units infiltrated deep, harassing and ambushing continuously, turning the enemy's pincer into a bloody nightmare. The hunter became the hunted. The elite paratroopers, used to swift victories, now found themselves lost in the jungle, picked off by snipers from unseen places, stepping on mines and traps at every turn. The mechanized columns along Route 4 were constantly ambushed, bridges destroyed, tanks and armored cars reduced to iron coffins on the road. And especially on the low riverfront, where the enemy's naval forces advanced fiercely, they met unimaginable resistance. Our artillery, hidden in the steep cliffs along the riverbanks, fired with deadly precision, turning the blue waters of the Lo into a grave for invaders. Victories at Doan Hung, Quan Bo, and especially the resounding Battle of Bong Lao, where we annihilated an entire enemy convoy, shattered one section after another of their supposedly unbreakable pincer. The trap they set to catch the gray tiger of Viet Buc had sprung shut, but on themselves. The plan for a lightning victory was completely destroyed. After more than 2 months of desperate struggle, suffering heavy losses in men and equipment, morale collapsing, General Salan was forced to order a humiliating retreat. The French winter offensive was utterly crushed. This was not only a military triumph, it was a victory of immense strategic meaning. We had safeguarded our leadership and preserved our main forces. More importantly, we proved to the world that through people's war, with intellect and determination, a small nation with crude weapons could defeat a professional invading army. Viet Buc, once merely a refuge, had become a symbol of resistance, a heart that could not be crushed. The first and fiercest trial by fire had passed, but it was only the overture to a symphony that would last for years. The war was entering a new phase, one of endurance, attrition, and force building, preparing for an earth-shaking counteroffensive. How would we endure this hardship? And what turning points lay ahead? The answers would soon be revealed. The victory of Viet Buc in the autumn-winter of 1947 was like a violent storm that had finally passed. The sky over the capital of the winds cleared once more, yet the air still carried the heavy dampness of the recent battle. The joy of triumph spread quietly through every camp and village, not in loud cheers or celebrations, but in firm handshakes, in trusting glances, in silent relief. Everyone, from the commander-in-chief to the local militia with hose and rifles, understood one harsh truth. We had only repelled an attack, not yet won the war. The enemy still remained, powerful and numerous. Their deadly trap had failed, but their chains were still tightening around us. After the bitter defeat of Operation Leia, the French colonialists realized that relying solely on military power to achieve a quick victory and destroy the resistance leadership was nothing but an illusion. They could not find our heart, hidden deep within the vast forests and the boundless will of the people. So they turned to a far more sinister and dangerous strategy: encirclement and strangulation. They no longer stormed the safety zone, ATK, directly. Instead, they built a dense system of fortresses and military posts, especially along the northern border, in an attempt to cut off all communication and supply lines between our forces and the outside world. They wanted to turn Viet Bac into an isolated island, a giant cage, waiting for the tiger inside to die of hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Now the enemy was not only the legionnaire with a rifle. The enemy was hunger, cold, the lack of salt, cloth, and medicine, isolation in information and diplomacy. This was total war on every front, economic, political, and military. And yet, in what seemed to be the darkest, most hopeless period, the spirit of Vietnam, the power of people's war, shone brighter than ever. Solving the crisis did not come from one grand battle, but from millions of small, determined acts carried out every day. To fight hunger, the movement Increasing Production is Patriotism was launched. Abandoned hillsides and stream banks became fields of rice and corn. Cassava and sweet potatoes planted hastily after military drills became the lifeline that sustained entire battalions. Every household saved a handful of rice a day, filling the great granaries of the front lines. To fight illiteracy, thousands of literacy classes sprang up beneath forest canopies and inside caves. The flickering firelight of the ABC classes at night burned brighter than city lamps because they lit the flame of knowledge, hope, and national pride. To produce weapons, our military workshops, with crude, handmade tools, worked day and night to turn enemy bombs and shells into grenades and bazookas, proudly stamped "Made in Viet Bac," striking terror into the invaders. It was a silence that terrified the enemy. They waited for collapse, but saw Viet Bac grow stronger. They waited for despair, but saw the will to resist sharpen ever further. From 1948 to 1950 were the 3 years of holding out and accumulation. Our army, once just scattered guerrilla units and small battalions, was reorganized into regiments and then into full divisions. The barefoot soldiers in brown shirts now had better weapons, better training, and a growing confidence for larger battles ahead. Yet one question hung heavily over the general command. How long must we endure? How long must we wait? The French noose, especially along Route 4, the lifeline connecting Lang Son to Cao Bang, was tightening around our base. Breaking it would open the border, connect us with the socialist allies, and bring much-needed international support. Failing to break it meant remaining trapped in passivity. Then, history called. In 1950, after careful analysis, the Party Central Committee and President Ho Chi Minh made a bold, decisive choice, one that would mark a new chapter in the war. The order was given to launch the border campaign, Chinh Dich Bien Goi, codenamed Le Hong Fong Su. Its objectives were clear and firm: annihilate a key portion of the enemy's forces, liberate part of the Vietnam-China border, and expand and strengthen the Viet Bac base. This would not be another small ambush or defensive skirmish. It was the first time our army would launch a large-scale offensive against the enemy's fortified system. It was the ultimate test of our strength, intelligence, and courage. To directly oversee the campaign, President Ho himself went to the front. The image of the old leader, in his simple khaki uniform, leaning on a walking stick, climbing a high mountain to observe the battlefield, became an immortal symbol, an endless source of inspiration for every soldier. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the commander-in-chief, spent sleepless nights over his maps, devising a brilliant, creative plan. We would not attack every position. We would strike one vital point to break the chain from within. The target, Dong Quai, a key but relatively weaker fortress along the RC4 defensive line. Our plan was attack the fort, strike the relief. First, concentrate overwhelming force to capture Dong Quai. Then, set ambushes to destroy the French troops coming from that quay to rescue it, and those retreating from Cao Bang. The enemy's strong defensive system would become its own death trap, because once one link broke, the entire chain would be forced to move, exposing itself to annihilation. At dawn on September 16, 1950, the campaign began. For the first time, our artillery participated in significant numbers, roaring to life and raining fire upon Dong Quai. From every direction, our infantry charged. The fighting was fierce and brutal. The French, heavily armed and well fortified, resisted desperately. But our soldiers, driven by the spirit of determined to die for the fatherland's survival, fought with extraordinary courage. As one fell, another rose to take his place. After more than 2 days of intense combat, we completely captured Dong Quai. The key link had been shattered. As the High Command predicted, the fall of Dong Quai left the French in Cao Bang isolated and the troops in that quai in chaos. They were forced to move, one to rescue, one to retreat, and that was when our second trap closed. Along Route 4, from Coxay to Hill 477, our ambushes awaited. The soldiers of the 308th Division and the 174th Cao Bok Lang Regiment turned the jagged limestone mountains and thick forests into a fiery hell for the enemy. The LePage column from that quai and the Charton column from Cao Bang were cut off, surrounded, and annihilated in pieces. The so-called Colonial Highway became the Road of Death, a river of blood for the French Expeditionary Corps. After nearly a month of fierce, intelligent, and heroic fighting, the border campaign of autumn-winter 1950 ended in total victory. The results exceeded all expectations. More than 8,000 enemy troops were killed or captured. A 750-kilometer stretch of border from Cao Bang to Din Lap, including 5 towns and 13 districts, was liberated. But above all, the enemy's encirclement and isolation of Viet Bac was completely broken. The gateway to the outside world swung open. From this moment, our resistance was no longer alone. We now had an international rear base to rely on. The victory of the 1950 border campaign was the answer, the revelation to the years of endurance. It was not just a military win, but a strategic turning point, marking the maturity of our army and the transformation of the revolution from defense to offense. The chains had been shattered. The tiger of Viet Bac was not only freed, it had grown wings. But as one door opened, a new horizon awaited, with even greater battles and fiercer challenges. How would the enemy respond to this earth-shaking defeat? And how would our army, soaring with newfound confidence, continue the march toward liberation? The road ahead, though brighter, was still lined with thorns. Victory is not measured only by the number of enemies destroyed or the square kilometers of land reclaimed. In its deepest and most eternal meaning, victory is measured by the transformation in the spirit of an entire nation. And when the storm called the border campaign of autumn-winter 1950 passed, leaving behind on the deadly Route 4 the wreckage of tanks and the terror of invaders, what remained, more precious than anything, was a new dawn in the mindset and will of the Vietnamese people. That dawn was not dazzling or blinding. It rose slowly and steadily from behind the limestone ranges of Viet Bac. It did not merely dispel the darkness of encirclement, but illuminated a completely new path for the resistance. The journey we had just endured, from the historic night in Viet Bac in 1947, was one of painful yet magnificent transformation. Let us recall where we began, from a young, isolated base surrounded on all sides by the enemy. That enemy, armed with overwhelming economic and military might, arrogantly believed that by tightening their siege and cutting off all supplies, the Viet Minh Tiger would eventually starve and fall. They were right, in part. Those years of endurance were years of indescribable hardship. Meals stretched with cassava instead of rice, patched and threadbare clothes, scarce medicine shared among comrades, and the haunting homesickness that filled the jungle nights. That endurance tested the limits of human perseverance. But the enemy made one fatal miscalculation. They could not fathom the strength of a people pushed to the edge, nor the depth of their patriotism and thirst for independence. Within that crucible of suffering, we did not perish. We forged ourselves into something stronger, more creative, and more united than ever before. Thus, the victory at the border campaign of 1950 was no miracle. It was the inevitable result of 3 long years of preparation and accumulation. It was the fruit born from the sweat of farmers cultivating extra fields for the front, from the tears of mothers sending their sons to war, from the ingenuity of weapons engineers working in dim huts, and from the blood of thousands of fallen soldiers. This victory proved a profound truth. The core lesson of the resistance, that internal strength, self-reliance, and resilience are the foundations of every triumph. Before we gained international recognition or aid, we had to stand on our own feet. We had to break our own chains before reaching out to friends around the world. This lesson is not only true in wartime, it is a guiding philosophy for our nation's future. A strong nation must first rely on its own resources, intellect, and courage. But the legacy of this victory extends even further. Look at the balance of power before and after the campaign. Before 1950, we were on the defensive. We reacted to enemy attacks. But after the border campaign, for the first time in the resistance, we seized the strategic initiative in the northern battlefield. Now, it was not us waiting to see where the enemy would strike. It was the French who trembled, trying to guess where our main forces would attack next. From the hunted, we became the hunters. This 180-degree shift dealt a devastating psychological blow to the invaders. The specter of another encirclement battle, another Route 4 disaster, haunted them, sapping their confidence and morale. In contrast, for our soldiers and people, faith in ultimate victory was solidified. Our troops, after defeating the most elite Foreign Legion battalions in their fortified positions, gained unmatched confidence and battlefield experience. They learned that with sound strategy and unyielding will, no fortress is impregnable, no enemy invincible. The change occurred not only on the battlefield, but also on the global political stage. The reopening of the Vietnam-China border officially linked our resistance to the broader movement of national liberation and the socialist bloc worldwide. Our war was no longer an isolated struggle. It became a symbol, an outpost against colonialism. The influx of weapons, equipment, food, and advisors from fraternal nations gave us new momentum, enabling our army to modernize rapidly. Yet this was a double-edged sword. It also drew the great powers deeper into the Indochina conflict. France, humiliated by defeat, received increasing American aid, transforming its colonial war into part of the U.S. global anti-communist strategy. The chessboard grew larger, more complex, and more perilous. The border campaign victory opened the door to the world, but it also thrust us into an international confrontation demanding even greater political and diplomatic resolve. Perhaps the most profound and moving lesson we can draw from this story is the lesson of sacrifice and the role of the people. Victory did not belong to any single brilliant commander, though President Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Nguyen Giap played extraordinary roles. This victory was built by tens of thousands of civilian laborers, barefoot, thin-shouldered men and women who trekked over mountains and forded rivers, carrying loads heavier than their own bodies to supply the front lines. The image of the bicycle convoys, the women cooking in the deep forest, the child messengers slipping through enemy checkpoints, together they wove an immortal epic of people's war. They carried no weapons, yet they were the true source of power, the lifeblood sustaining the army. They proved a simple but eternal truth. A war can only be won when it truly belongs to the people. The army is the fish. The people are the water. And when the fish swims in the boundless sea of the people's heart, no force on earth can destroy it. So, as we close this glorious chapter of history, what remains for us today? The story of the 1950 breakthrough is not merely a tale of pride. It is a question posed to our present. In this age of peace, the siege we face is no longer of guns and fortresses. Today's encirclement may be economic stagnation, technological dependency, climate change, cultural erosion amid globalization, or even inertia and complacency in our own minds. Just like our forefathers once did, we now face the same question. How will we break the sieges of our time? Do we still have the courage to make bold, decisive choices, like the one to launch the border campaign? Can we still harness our inner strength, our creativity, our spirit of self-reliance? Or will we wait for help from others? Most importantly, can we preserve the unity, the solidarity between people and leadership, like fish and water, that once carried us through every hardship? The answer lies not far away. It lies within each of us. The legacy of the border campaign is not merely a liberated frontier. Its greatest legacy is a liberated spirit, the courage to think, to act, to face challenges head-on, and the unshakable belief in the strength of our own nation. As long as that flame of spirit continues to burn, we will always have the power to break every chain, open every door, and stride confidently toward the future. History has handed us this lesson. How we use it depends on us, today and tomorrow.